A white millionaire's wife gives birth to black triplets, but a nurse's letter holds the key to this mystery. What shocking truth will be revealed, changing their lives forever? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. Charles Whitman stood at the window of his expansive Manhattan penthouse, watching the last guests leave the celebration. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors, and the remnants of the party, champagne flutes, gift wrappings, and congratulatory cards littered the surfaces. Just hours ago, this space had been filled with the city's elite, all gathered to celebrate the arrival of his and Emily's triplets. The party had been meticulously planned, despite being hastily arranged after their surrogate gave birth 2 weeks early. Charles had insisted on hosting it immediately, wanting to establish their position as proud parents in their social circle. The guest list included partners from his investment firm, Emily's colleagues from her art gallery, and their carefully curated circle of friends. Everyone who mattered in their world had been there, raising crystal glasses filled with vintage champagne to toast the newest additions to the Whitman family. During the celebration, Charles had maintained his composure, accepting congratulations with practiced ease. But he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his stomach every time someone asked to see photos of the babies. He'd watched their reactions carefully, the slight widening of eyes, the quick glances between spouses, the forced smiles. No one dared say anything directly, but Charles knew they were all thinking the same thing. How could Charles and Emily Whitman, both unmistakably white, have 3 black babies? Emily appeared beside him, her designer dress slightly wrinkled from the day's activities. "The babies are finally asleep," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and joy. She slipped her arm through his, but he remained rigid. "Charles, please. We talked about this. There are children." He turned to face his wife, the woman he'd built his life with over the past decade. Emily's face showed signs of strain beneath her carefully applied makeup. "I know they're ours," he said, his voice low and controlled. "But you saw how everyone was looking at us today. This isn't going to go away, Emily. We live in a world where appearance matters." The nursery door stood ajar down the hallway, and Charles could see the 3 cribs arranged in a perfect row. Each contained a sleeping infant, their dark skin a stark contrast against the white Egyptian cotton sheets Emily had specially ordered. The sight triggered a complex mixture of emotions in Charles: love, confusion, fear, and something else he couldn't quite name. "We can handle this," Emily insisted, though her voice wavered slightly. "We've handled everything else life has thrown at us. Remember when your father tried to stop our wedding because I wasn't from the right social circle? We got through that." Charles pulled away from her, walking toward his office. "This is different," he said. "This isn't about social circles or family expectations. This is about—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the windows when they heard the doorbell. Sarah, the nurse who had assisted during the delivery, stood in the doorway. She wore simple scrubs and carried a manila envelope, looking out of place among the luxury of the Whitman residence. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her expression serious. "I found this at the hospital. I thought you should see it right away." She held out the envelope, and Charles took it with trembling fingers. "It's about the fertility clinic," she added quietly, glancing at Emily, who had appeared in the hallway. The envelope felt heavy in Charles's hands, though it contained only a single sheet of paper. Sarah's presence, her serious expression, and the weight of this moment seemed to compress the air in the room. Charles knew, with the certainty that had helped him build his fortune, that whatever was in this envelope would change everything. Emily stepped forward, reaching for the envelope, but Charles pulled it back instinctively. "Let me read it first," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The babies were still sleeping peacefully in their nursery, unaware that their world was about to shift on its axis. Sarah stood awkwardly by the door, clearly uncertain whether to stay or go. "I'll check on the babies," she offered, giving them space but remaining within reach if needed. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway as she walked toward the nursery. Charles stared at the envelope, his mind racing through possibilities. The fertility clinic had seemed perfect, state-of-the-art facilities, impeccable reputation, discretion guaranteed. They had spent a small fortune ensuring everything would be perfect. Yet here he stood, holding what he suspected was evidence that something had gone terribly wrong. Emily touched his arm gently. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," she said, but Charles could hear the fear in her voice. They both knew that some revelations could shake even the strongest foundations. Charles retreated to his study, a room that had witnessed countless business deals and decisions that shaped his fortune. Now, it would witness perhaps the most significant moment of his life. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the envelope in his trembling hands. He settled into his leather chair, the one where he'd made million-dollar decisions without hesitation, but now he found himself paralyzed by the simple act of opening an envelope. The paper inside was official letterhead from the fertility clinic. As his eyes scanned the contents, the carefully constructed reality of his world began to crumble. The letter detailed a catastrophic error in the laboratory's procedures. During the in vitro fertilization process, his sperm sample had been mixed up with another client's. The clinical language did nothing to soften the blow. Due to a procedural error during the handling of genetic materials, we regret to inform you that an unintended cross-contamination occurred between donor samples. Charles read the paragraph 3 times, each time hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into a different meaning. The letter went on to explain that the clinic had discovered the error during a routine audit of their procedures. They expressed their deepest regrets and offered free genetic counseling services, as if that could somehow make up for this catastrophic breach of trust. His hands began to shake more violently, and he set the letter down on his mahogany desk. The room suddenly felt too small, too confined. The walls of family photos seemed to mock him, generations of Whitmans looking down at him with judgment in their painted eyes. His father's portrait, in particular, seemed to stare directly at him with disappointment. Emily found him like this, staring at the letter as if it were a venomous snake. She had given him space, knowing her husband's need to process things alone, but her patience had worn thin. "Charles," she called from the doorway. When he didn't respond, she stepped into the room, her footsteps muffled by the Persian carpet. "Charles, you're scaring me. What does it say?" He couldn't bring himself to look at her. Emily, who had gone through so much to have these babies. Emily, who had endured countless hormone treatments, who had cried with joy when they finally found a surrogate. Emily, who had spent 9 months planning every detail of their children's lives. How could he tell her that it had all been built on a mistake? "They made a mistake," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "At the clinic, with my sample." The words felt like glass in his throat. "The babies, they're not." He couldn't finish the sentence. Emily moved closer, picking up the letter with surprisingly steady hands. As she read, Charles watched her face transform. Shock, disbelief, anger, and something else, something deeper and more painful, cycled across her features. The letter slipped from her fingers and floated to the floor like a fallen leaf. "But they're ours," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We created them. We wanted them. We loved them before they even existed." She placed her hands on the desk, leaning forward as if the weight of this revelation might cause her to collapse. "This doesn't change anything." Charles stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall. "Doesn't change anything?" His voice rose with each word. "Emily, look at them. Everyone can see they're not mine. Do you have any idea what this means? For our reputation? For their future? For my legacy?" Emily's face hardened at his words. "Legacy? Is that what you're worried about? Not the 3 innocent babies sleeping in the next room? Not the family we've dreamed of for years?" She straightened up, and Charles recognized the set of her jaw, the same expression she wore when fighting for an artist she believed in at her gallery. "We need to think about this rationally," Charles said, trying to regain his composure. "There are legal implications. We could sue the clinic. We could sue." Emily interrupted, her voice sharp. "And then what? Return them like defective merchandise? There are children, Charles. We signed papers. We made promises. We prepared for months to be their parents. The distance between them seemed to grow with each word, though neither had moved. The morning light that had seemed so harsh earlier now felt weak and insufficient, as if even it couldn't illuminate a path forward through this crisis. "I need time to think," Charles said finally, turning toward the window. Behind him, he heard Emily's sharp intake of breath, a sound he recognized as the precursor to tears she would refuse to shed in his presence. She had always been strong that way, holding herself together until she was alone. "While you're thinking," she said, her voice steady despite everything, "remember that those babies don't know anything about sperm samples or clinics or mistakes. They only know that they're supposed to be loved and protected by us. That's the promise we made when we decided to become parents." She left the room quietly, leaving Charles alone with the letter, his thoughts, and the weight of a decision that would define not just his future, but the futures of 3 innocent lives sleeping peacefully in their cribs, unaware that their world had just been irrevocably altered. The news spread through their affluent community like wildfire, moving from whispered conversations at country clubs to increasingly bold social media posts. Charles discovered this while scrolling through his phone during what should have been a routine morning review of financial markets. Instead, he found himself staring at a local news website's headline, "Prominent Investment Bankers Fertility Clinic Scandal. What Really Happened to the Whitmans?" The article itself was a masterpiece of innuendo and barely concealed sensationalism. Anonymous sources close to the family provided supposed details about the fertility treatments, Emily's struggles to conceive, and speculations about the clinic's procedures. The comment section beneath the article was even worse, filled with crude jokes and armchair opinions about genetics and race. Charles felt his stomach turn as he read comment after comment. Some questioned his masculinity, others suggested Emily had been unfaithful, and still others debated whether wealthy, white people should be allowed to raise Black children at all. The discussion had moved far beyond the simple facts of a clinic's mistake and into territory that revealed the ugly underbelly of their supposedly progress. Civ society. Emily found him in this state, his face illuminated by his phone's screen in his darkened office. She had been up all night with the babies, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "We need to take control of this narrative," she said, placing a cup of coffee on his desk. "If we don't tell our story, others will tell it for us." Charles looked up at his wife, noting how she had already dressed for the day in one of her power suits, her armor against the world. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Emily had built her reputation in the art world through strategic media management and carefully orchestrated public appearances. "A press conference," she said, sitting across from him. "We need to face this head-on. Show everyone that we're not hiding, that we're not ashamed, and most importantly, that we're united." The slight tremor in her voice on the word united didn't escape Charles's notice. The press conference was arranged for the following afternoon in the grand ballroom of their building. Emily's PR team worked through the night, preparing statements and coaching them on potential questions. Charles watched as they transformed the space where they had celebrated their baby's arrival just days ago into a media battlefield. As cameras were set up and journalists filed in, Charles stood backstage, adjusting his tie for the 1,000th time. Emily appeared beside him, looking immaculate in a conservative blue dress that projected both authority and maternal warmth. "Remember," she whispered, "we're not victims here. We're parents defending our family." The lights were blinding as they took their seats at the long table. Charles could barely make out individual faces in the crowd, but he could feel the weight of dozens of cameras and hundreds of eyes. Emily spoke first, her voice clear and unwavering as she delivered their prepared statement about love, family, and the unimportance of genetic connections in the face of parental devotion. Then came the questions, and with them, the real test began. "Mr. Whitman," called out a reporter from the front row, "given your family's long history in this city and your position in the financial community, how do you respond to suggestions that this situation could damage investor confidence in your firm?" Before Charles could respond, another voice cut through the room. "Mrs. Whitman, sources suggest you were aware of the possibility of mixed samples before the births. Can you comment on these allegations?" The questions became increasingly aggressive, personal, and pointed. Charles felt sweat running down his back beneath his expensive suit. Emily maintained her composure, but he could see her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the table. What messages are you sending to other couples considering IVF? Have you considered legal action against the clinic? Will you be seeking the biological father? How will you explain this to your children when they're older? Each question seemed designed to probe their deepest insecurities, to expose the fault lines in their carefully constructed responses. Charles found himself stumbling over answers he had rehearsed perfectly just hours before. The room began to feel smaller, the lights hotter, the cameras more intrusive. The final blow came from a reporter in the back, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Mr. Whitman, given your family's historical position in society, how do you reconcile this situation with your father's well-documented views on racial integration?" Emily reached for Charles's hand under the table, but he had already half risen from his chair, his face flushed. The PR team quickly called an end to the questions, but the damage was done. As they left the stage, the murmur of the crowd followed them, along with the rapid-fire clicks of cameras capturing their retreat. The aftermath of the press conference left a tangible strain on Charles and Emily's relationship. Their penthouse, once a sanctuary of shared dreams and ambitions, became a battleground of unspoken tensions and careful silences. The morning after the media disaster, Charles retreated to his home office, while Emily tended to the babies with an almost fierce protectiveness. Their first major confrontation erupted over breakfast when Charles suggested they should consider moving to their house in the Hamptons until things settled down. Emily set down her coffee cup with such force that liquid splashed onto the imported tablecloth. "Running away won't solve anything," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "These are our children, not a PR crisis to manage." Charles ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that had become increasingly frequent. "You're not being realistic, Emily. Did you see the headlines this morning? Whitman Heritage in question. Banking dynasty faces identity crisis. My board members are calling emergency meetings. Clients are getting nervous. And that's more important than our family?" Emily's voice rose sharply, causing one of the babies to stir in the nearby bassinet. She immediately lowered her voice, but her intensity remained. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but I never thought you'd be more concerned about your business reputation than our children's well-being." Their argument was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah, the nurse who had become a daily presence in their home. She entered the kitchen with professional confidence, seemingly unfazed by the tension in the room. "Good morning," she said, moving directly to check on the baby in the bassinet. "I thought I might take the little ones for their morning routine, give you both some time to talk." Emily watched as Sarah expertly lifted the baby, her movements gentle and assured. There was something about the nurse's presence that seemed to defuse the tension in the room. Perhaps it was her matter-of-fact approach to everything, her refusal to treat their situation as anything other than normal. Later that afternoon, while Charles was on a conference call with his board, Emily found herself in the nursery with Sarah. The nurse was changing one of the babies, her dark hands moving with practiced efficiency. "You know," Sarah said casually, not looking up from her task, "I've been a labor and delivery nurse for 15 years. I've seen all kinds of families. The ones that succeed aren't always the ones that look alike." Emily sank into the nursing chair, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "How do you handle it? The stares, the judgments." The question came out before she could stop herself, revealing her deepest fears. Sarah finished with the diaper and picked up the baby, cradling him with natural ease. "I was 19 when I had my first child," she said. "Single mother, working 2 jobs to put myself through nursing school. People judged me too. But here's what I learned. Those who matter don't mind, and those who mind don't matter." As they talked, Sarah shared more of her story. The discrimination she faced as a young Black nurse in an affluent hospital, the assumptions people made about her capabilities, the way she learned to hold her head high despite it all. Emily found herself drawing strength from Sarah's experiences, seeing parallels in their situations despite their different backgrounds. "The hardest part," Sarah confided, "isn't dealing with strangers. It's watching someone you love struggle with their own prejudices." She gave Emily a meaningful look. Your husband isn't a bad person. He's just facing something he never prepared for. Sometimes people need time to align their hearts with their circumstances. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Charles's raised voice from his office, fragments of his argument with the board drifting down the hallway. Emily closed her eyes, feeling tears threatening to fall. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly. Not of what others think, but that Charles might never fully accept them. That he'll always see them as a mistake that needs to be managed rather than children who need to be loved. Sarah placed the baby in Emily's arms, and the weight of the tiny body seemed to anchor her to the moment. "Hold on to this feeling," Sarah advised. "This connection you have with your children, it's real, it's powerful, and it's more important than any society page or board meeting. Your husband will either learn to see that, or he'll miss out on something precious." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of feedings, changings, and quiet conversations. Sarah's presence became a bridge between Emily's determination to embrace their new reality and Charles's struggle to reconcile it with his worldview. When Charles finally emerged from his office, looking worn and defeated, Sarah tactfully busied herself with the babies, giving the couple space while remaining within earshot as a silent supporter of their fragile peace. Charles sat alone in his office, surrounded by the trappings of his success, awards, photographs with political figures, and the leather-bound books that lined his custom shelves. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk, where a framed photo of his own father stood prominently. The elder Whitman's stern expression seemed to judge him from beyond the grave, a constant reminder of expectations and legacy. He found himself repeatedly opening his phone to check social media, each notification bringing a new wave of anxiety. His closest friend, Richard, had sent several messages suggesting they meet for drinks at their usual club. Charles knew what that meant. Richard, like many in their circle, wanted to offer advice about the situation. The kind of advice that came wrapped in concerned looks and carefully chosen words about difficult decisions and practical solutions. The sound of laughter drifted in from the living room, where Emily had invited several of their closest friends for what she called a support gathering. Charles remained in his office, his door slightly ajar, listening to the conversations that floated through. He recognized Jennifer's voice, Emily's oldest friend from college, speaking in animated tones about the baby's different personalities. Then Marcus, their neighbor from 2 floors down, discussing his own experiences as a mixed-race child in private schools. The conversation shifted when someone, Charles thought it might be Patricia from Emily's gallery, brought up the press conference. "You both handled it so bravely," she said, though her tone carried an undercurrent of something else. "Pity? Skepticism? But surely you must be considering your options. I mean, legally speaking." Charles heard Emily's sharp intake of breath, followed by her measured response. "Our only option is to love and raise our children. There's nothing to consider beyond that." Her voice carried a finality that should have ended the discussion, but didn't. "But darling," Patricia continued, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a discreet level, "think about their future, the questions they'll face, the challenges. Is it really fair to them?" The sound of a glass being set down too firmly on a table echoed through the apartment. "Fair." Emily's voice had taken on the edge Charles recognized from their own arguments. What's not fair is suggesting that love and family should be determined by matching skin colors. What's not fair is implying that our children would be better off without us. Charles found himself moving closer to his office door, drawn by the escalating tension in the living room. He heard Richard's voice now, speaking in the reasonable tone he used during difficult board meetings. "Emily, we're all just concerned about what's best for everyone involved. Charles's position in the community, his family's legacy, these things matter. They affect not just your family, but everyone con. Ted to the Whitman name." "The Whitman name?" Emily's laugh held no humor. "Let me tell you about the Whitman name. It's carried by 3 beautiful babies sleeping in the next room. They're its future, whether anyone likes it or not." The sound of movement followed, people gathering their things, making excuses, heading for the door. Charles stood frozen in his office, caught between the impulse to support his wife and the pull of his lifelong friendships. Through the crack in the door, he watched Richard pause in the hallway, looking toward his office with expectation. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken words, before Richard finally turned and followed the others out. When the last guest had gone, Charles emerged from a sanctuary to find Emily standing in the middle of their living room, arms wrapped around herself as if for protection. The space felt emptier somehow, as if their friends had taken more than just their physical presence when they left. "You could have joined us," Emily said without turning around. "Shown them that we're united in this." Charles moved to the bar cart, pouring himself a drink with hands that weren't quite steady. United in what exactly? In pretending this isn't complicated? In acting like everything's normal? Emily turned to face him then, her expression a mixture of determination and exhaustion.
"No, Charles."
United in loving our children. United in facing whatever comes next together. United in showing the world that family isn't about matching DNA or maintaining some outdated idea of legacy. The weight of their different perspectives hung between them, heavier than ever. Outside their windows, the city continued its endless motion, unaware of the drama unfolding in the penthouse above. In the nursery, one of the babies began to cry, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. Emily moved toward the nursery, pausing at the doorway. "You know what's ironic?" she said, her voice soft but clear. "Everyone's so worried about your family's legacy. But maybe this is exactly what the Whitman legacy needed, a chance to prove that it's about more than just appearance and social status. A chance to show that it can adapt and grow and become something better." The therapist's office occupied a discreet brownstone in the Upper East Side, far enough from their social circle to provide privacy. Dr. Elena Martinez specialized in couples counseling and family dynamics, coming highly recommended by Sarah, who had noticed the growing strain between Charles and Emily. The waiting room featured muted colors and comfortable furniture, creating an atmosphere that encouraged openness. Their first session began with an uncomfortable silence. Charles sat rigidly on one end of the sofa while Emily perched on the other, the space between them speaking volumes. Dr. Martinez observed them with practiced patience, her notepad balanced on her knee, waiting for someone to break the ice. "We're here because we need help navigating our new reality," Emily finally began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "Our children are perfect, but the circumstances of their birth have created complications we weren't prepared for." Dr. Martinez nodded, turning her attention to Charles. "And what are your thoughts on these complications, Mr. Whitman?" Charles loosened his tie, a gesture that revealed his discomfort with the situation. "My thoughts." He let out a bitter laugh. "My thoughts are that our entire lives have been turned upside down. Everything I thought I knew about my future, my family's future, has been completely derailed." The therapist leaned forward slightly. "Let's explore that. What exactly did you envision for your future before this happened?" As Charles spoke about his family's history, his father's expectations, and the weight of the Whitman name, Dr. Martinez guided him toward deeper revelations. She helped him understand how his identity had become inextricably linked with his family's legacy, and how the current situation challenged not just his public image, but his fundamental sense of self. Emily listened intently, tears forming in her eyes as Charles revealed vulnerabilities he'd never shared before. "I wake up every morning loving those babies," he admitted, his voice cracking. "But then I catch myself wondering if love is enough. If we're equipped to handle the challenges they'll face. If I'm strong enough to be the father they need." Over subsequent sessions, Dr. Martinez helped them develop better communication strategies. She taught them to express their fears without accusation, to listen without immediately defending. Emily shared her own insecurities about motherhood, about whether she could protect their children from the prejudices they would face. "What strikes me," Dr. Martinez observed during their fourth session, "is that you're both experiencing similar fears, but expressing them differently. Emily, you channel your anxiety into action, organizing support groups, researching inclusive education options. Charles, you retreat into familiar patterns of control and management." The breakthrough came during a session where they discussed their children's future. Dr. Martinez asked them to write letters to their children, to be opened on their 18th birthday. As they read their letters aloud, both found themselves overcome with emotion. Emily's letter spoke of unconditional love, of the joy their arrival brought, of her fierce determination to create a world worthy of their presence. Charles's letter, surprisingly, revealed a depth of feeling he had struggled to express. He wrote about learning to be brave, about challenging his own prejudices, about wanting to build a legacy of love rather than mere social status. "I want them to know," Charles read, his voice thick with emotion, "that they made me a better man, that they taught me what really matters, that sometimes the most precious gifts come in unexpected packages." Between sessions, they began implementing the communication techniques they learned. Their dinner conversations, once fraught with tension, became opportunities for honest dialogue. Emily shared her research on transracial adoption and multicultural parenting. Charles, initially resistant, found himself taking notes and asking questions. The nursery became their practice ground for new patterns of interaction. One evening, as they sat together during the baby's bedtime routine, Charles watched Emily singing softly to their daughter. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about what you said regarding the Whitman legacy. Maybe this is our chance to redefine it, to make it stand for something more meaningful than social status or appearance." Emily reached for his hand, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't hesitate to take it. "That's exactly what I've been trying to say," she whispered. "These babies aren't a challenge to your legacy, Charles. They're an opportunity to make it stronger, more inclusive, more loving." Dr. Martinez had warned them that healing wouldn't be linear. There would be good days and bad days, steps forward and steps back. But as they left their latest session, walking closer together than they had in weeks, both felt a cautious optimism about their future. Sarah's initiative to organize a community event promoting diversity and acceptance came at a crucial moment in the Whitmans' journey. The event was planned for the Grand Ballroom of the Metropolitan Community Center, a neutral venue that would attract a diverse audience. Sarah had carefully structured it as a forum for different families to share their experiences with adoption, mixed-race families, and non-traditional parenting. While Emily immediately embraced the opportunity, seeing it as a chance to transform their personal challenge into a broader conversation about family and acceptance, Charles retreated into familiar patterns of hesitation. The morning of the event, he stood in their bedroom, adjusting his tie for the 10th time, his reflection in the mirror showing the strain of internal conflict. "I'm not sure I can do this," he admitted to Emily, who was finishing her own preparations. "Speaking at a shareholders' meeting is one thing. This is different. These people will expect me to bare my soul, to talk about feelings and transformation. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make it worse?" Emily paused in applying her lipstick, studying her husband's reflection. The past few weeks of therapy had taught her to look beyond his words to the fear underlying them. "What's really bothering you, Charles? We've practiced our speeches. We know our story." Charles sat heavily on the edge of their bed, his normally perfect posture crumbling. "I keep thinking about my father," he confessed. "About what he would say if he could see me now speaking at an event about diversity and inclusion. He spent his entire life maintaining certain standards. And here I am, about to stand up and essentially reject everything he believed in." Sarah arrived early to help them prepare, finding them in this moment of tension. She had become more than just a nurse to the family. She had evolved into a bridge between their old world and their new reality. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had helped guide them through numerous difficult moments, "sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose to be better than those who came before us." The community center's ballroom filled quickly. The audience was notably different from their usual social circles. Families of various races and compositions, community leaders, social workers, and even a few familiar faces from their own wealthy enclave who had chosen to show support. In the front row, a young couple who had recently adopted twins from Ethiopia sat next to a single father raising his biracial daughters. Their presence reminded Charles that they weren't alone in navigating these complex waters. Emily was scheduled to speak first, but as they sat waiting for their turn, Charles suddenly reached for the microphone. "If you don't mind," he whispered to the organizer, "I'd like to go first." Emily squeezed his hand, Recognizing the significance of this moment, Charles Whitman, for the first time in his life, choosing to lead with vulnerability rather than carefully crafted control. His hands trembled slightly as he approached the podium, but his voice was steady when he began. For generations, the Whitman name has been associated with tradition, with maintaining the status quo. My father used to say that our greatest responsibility was preserving our legacy. It's taken me 3 beautiful babies and a lot of soul-searching to understand that sometimes preserving a legacy means having the courage to transform it. Emily watched from her seat as her husband spoke, tears forming in her eyes as she witnessed his public metamorphosis. The audience leaned forward, drawn in by the raw honesty of a man they had only known through newspaper headlines and society pages. Sarah, standing at the back of the room with one of the babies in her arms, nodded encouragingly as Charles continued to share their journey. This was more than just another public appearance. It was Charles's declaration of independence from the constraints of his upbringing. It was his first step toward not just accepting but embracing their new reality. As he spoke about his struggles, his fears, and his growing understanding of what truly matters in building a family, the atmosphere in the room shifted from polite attention to genuine connection. The impact of Charles's speech resonated through the auditorium like ripples in a still pond. When he finished speaking, the silence lasted for several heartbeats before erupting into genuine, heartfelt applause. People rose to their feet, not out of social obligation, but because they had witnessed something authentic, and transformative. Charles stood at the podium, momentarily overwhelmed by the response, until Emily joined him on stage. Emily's planned speech transformed into something more spontaneous as she built upon the foundation Charles had laid. My husband spoke about transforming legacies, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. But what we're really talking about is love's ability to transcend every boundary we create. Our children have taught us that family isn't about matching genetics or maintaining appearances. It's about choosing love every single day, especially when that choice isn't easy. The audience's response grew even stronger as other families began sharing their own stories. A successful African-American executive spoke about adopting white twins from Russia. A mixed-race couple described their journey through fertility treatments. Each story built upon the last, creating a tapestry of experiences that normalized what had once seemed extraordinary to the Whitmans. Social media, which had been their enemy just weeks before, began to shift its narrative. Someone had recorded Charles's speech on their phone, and clips began circulating online. The comment section, usually a breeding ground for criticism, filled with supportive messages. Finally, someone from the old money crowd speaking truth about what family really means. Watching Charles Whitman challenge his own prejudices gives me hope for real change. This is what courage looks like, choosing love over tradition. Major news outlets picked up the story, but the angle had changed dramatically. Instead of scandal and sensation, they focused on transformation and growth. The New York Times ran a feature titled, "Redefining Family: The Whitman Journey," which explored how their story reflected broader changes in American society's understanding of family and belonging. Charles found himself forwarding these articles to his board members, not as damage control, but as proud evidence of their family's evolution. The same business associates who had expressed concerns about the impact on their firm now spoke about the positive publicity and the potential for the Whitman name to represent progressive values in the financial sector. During a follow-up interview with a respected morning show, the interviewer asked Charles what had changed. His response, unscripted and sincere, captured the essence of their journey. "I used to think preserving my family's legacy meant maintaining the status quo. Now I understand that real legacy building is about having the courage to evolve. My children haven't diluted the Whitman name. They've enriched it with new meaning, new possibilities, and a deeper understanding of what family truly means." The interview went viral, shared across platforms by people who saw in the Whitman story a reflection of America's own struggling transformation toward greater acceptance and understanding. Comments poured in from other wealthy families facing similar situations, but who had remained silent out of fear. The Whitmans had inadvertently become pioneers, showing that even the most traditional institutions could adapt and grow. Emily noticed the change in Charles most profoundly in quiet moments at home. He no longer stiffened when they took the babies for walks in Central Park. Instead, he began pointing out other diverse families to her, noting with pride that their children would grow up in a world where such families were increasingly common. The tension that had characterized their early days with the babies gradually dissolved, replaced by a new confidence in their chosen path. The gradual shift in public opinion provided welcome relief, but the real transformation continued to unfold within the privacy of the Whitman home. One evening, as Charles sat in the nursery rocking one of the babies to sleep, Sarah entered to check on their evening routine. She paused in the doorway, observing the natural ease that had loped between father and child. "You know," Sarah began, her voice soft in the dimly lit room, "I've been meaning to share something with you both." Emily, who had been changing another baby's diaper, turned to listen. Sarah sat in the second rocking chair, her usual professional demeanor softening as she prepared to share her personal story. "I was adopted," she revealed, the words carrying the weight of years of experience. "My birth mother was white, and my adoptive parents were black. Back then, in the 1980s, that kind of adoption raised even more eyebrows than it does now." She described growing up in a family where love transcended racial boundaries, though not without challenges. Her adoptive parents had faced many of the same questions and doubts that now confronted the Whitmans. Charles listened intently, the baby sleeping peacefully against his chest. "How did your parents handle it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid disturbing the infant. "The stares, the questions, the judgment?" Sarah's response came with the wisdom of lived experience. "They taught me that family isn't about matching skin colors, it's about matching hearts. My mother used to say that love doesn't come in colors, it comes in actions and choices." She shared stories of her childhood, of the ways her parents had helped her build a strong identity while acknowledging and celebrating all parts of her heritage. Emily moved closer, drawn by the personal nature of Sarah's revelation. "Were there times when you wondered about your biological parents?" The question emerged from her deepest fears about their children's future. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Of course. Every adopted child goes through that phase of questioning. But what my parents gave me was a foundation of such unconditional love that those questions never threatened my sense of belonging. They made sure I knew that being curious about my biological heritage didn't diminish my place in our family." The conversation continued late into the evening, with Sarah sharing practical advice drawn from her unique perspective as both an adopted child and a healthcare professional. She spoke about the importance of creating an environment where their children could freely express their questions and concerns about identity. She emphasized the value of connecting with other families like theirs, building a community where their children would see themselves reflected. Charles found himself taking mental notes, his banker's precision now turned toward understanding the nuances of raising children whose experiences would differ from his own. "I've been so focused on what other people think," he admitted, "that I almost lost sight of what really matters, giving our children the security of knowing they're loved unconditionally." Emily reached for her husband's hand, remembering their journey from those first shocking moments in the hospital to now. "We're not just raising children," she reflected. "We're raising future adults who will need to navigate a complex world. Sarah, you're helping us understand how to prepare them for that journey." Sarah stood to leave, her shift ending but her impact lasting. "The most beautiful families," she said, pausing at the nursery door, "are the ones built on choice. Every day, you choose to love these babies. Every day, you choose to be their parents. That choice, made again and again, is what creates the strongest bonds." As Sarah's footsteps faded down the hallway, Charles and Emily remained in the nursery, surrounded by the gentle sounds of their sleeping children. The room felt different somehow, as if Sarah's story had added another layer of security to their family foundation. They had moved beyond merely accepting their situation to truly embracing it, understanding that their family's uniqueness was not a burden to bear, but a gift to celebrate. The revelation that would complete the Whitmans' journey arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Charles was in his home office, reviewing quarterly reports, when his secretary announced an unexpected visitor, James Anderson, his childhood friend whom he hadn't seen in nearly a decade. The moment James stepped into the office, Charles noticed something different about his old friend's demeanor, a mixture of nervousness and determination that seemed out of character for the usually confident surgeon. "I need to tell you something," James began, declining the offered seat. "It's about your children." He pulled out a familiar-looking envelope, and Charles immediately recognized the letterhead of the fertility clinic. Before he could speak, James continued, "I was there, Charles. The same clinic, the same week. When I saw the news about your situation, I had them check the records. The samples that were mixed up, they were mine." The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Charles found himself studying his old friend's face, noting for the first time features that he might have overlooked before, subtle characteristics that he now recognized in his own children. The world seemed to shift on its axis as pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. Emily, who had been summoned to the office, stood in the doorway, one hand pressed against the frame for support. James turned to her, his expression full of conflicting emotions. "I'm not here to disrupt your family," he said quickly. I thought you deserved to know the truth. And I wanted you to know that I understand and support the amazing job you're both doing as parents." The conversation that followed lasted hours, stretching into the evening. James shared his own story, his struggle with infertility, his decision to freeze samples before undergoing cancer treatment, his subsequent recovery, and his recent marriage. He spoke about watching the Whitmans' journey from afar, seeing how they had faced public scrutiny and emerged stronger. "When I first realized what had happened," James explained, "I was afraid to come forward. But watching you both, especially at that community event, I realized that maybe this wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe this was meant to be exactly this way." Charles found himself remembering their childhood together, how James, the son of their family's longtime gardener, had been his constant companion despite their different social standings. How his father had disapproved of their friendship but tolerated it because James was brilliant and destined for success. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. "I want you to be part of their lives," Charles said suddenly, surprising even himself with the conviction in his voice. "Not as a replacement or a secret, but as family. Because that's what you've always been. Even if I forgot that for a while." Emily moved to stand beside her husband, her hand finding his shoulder. "Our children deserve to know their entire story," she agreed. "And having more people to love them can only make them stronger." The weight that had been pressing on Charles's chest for months finally lifted. Here, in this unexpected moment, he found the last piece of acceptance he had been struggling to reach. These children were his not because of genetics or social expectations, but because he chose them, just as he now chose to expand their family circle to include James. The story of the Whitman triplets would indeed be extraordinary, but not for the reasons initially splashed across newspaper headlines. Their story would be about how love transcends biology, how family is both inherited and chosen, and how the deepest bonds are forged not in perfect circumstances, but in how we rise to meet life's unexpected challenges. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting long shadows through the office windows, 3 adults began planning a future that none of them could have imagined months ago. In the nursery down the hall, 3 babies slept peacefully, unaware that their family, Ly, had just grown stronger, richer, and more complete through the very circumstances that had once threatened to tear it apart. The Whitman legacy had indeed been transformed, not diminished. It now stood for something far more valuable than social status or genetic continuity. It stood for the power of love to transcend boundaries, for the courage to choose family over convention, and for the truth that the strongest bonds are those we forge through understanding, acceptance, and unconditional love.